There aren't many vehicle names as iconic as Land Cruiser, but did you know that there are actually 3 different Land Cruisers sold around the world? We still have the Land Cruiser 70, if you're lucky enough to live in countries like Australia, Japan, and South Africa. That's the same rugged model in production since 1984. Of course, if you live most elsewhere in the world, you can also get the Land Cruiser 300, the Big Daddy Land Cruiser, the latest version of the one that we last got in the United States. I'd love to know what you all think of the styling on the new Land Cruiser. Personally, I think they knocked it out of the park. I love the chunky proportions, the two-tone paint scheme that we find on this model, the bulging fender flares, the very upright front end as well. Now, if I had to choose, I would say that the base version's round headlights are more attractive than these square headlights, but that's a personal choice, and you can swap them yourself. It's a little bit more complicated than simply deleting this module here because this lower bumper insert also has to change, but it is possible. For 2025, there are 2 different trims available. The 1958 trim, that's the base version. It gets the round headlights and it doesn't have this same body-colored insert. And then we have this one, which, I kid you not, is the 2025 Toyota Land Cruiser. Land Cruiser. Yep, Land Cruiser is the name. Land Cruiser is also the name of the trim. The interesting thing about this Land Cruiser is that it's really not that much smaller than the bigger Land Cruiser. It's only about ½ an inch shorter in terms of height and only ½ an inch narrower as well. Although the big Land Cruiser doesn't have quite the same flare, so the interior is a little bit wider. Now, design-wise, I love the egg crate thing going on here, but I am getting just a little bit of Hyundai Pixel. Let me know if you're getting that as well. Are you a fan of traditional body-on-frame SUVs? Well, so is Toyota. They currently have the broadest and the freshest body-on-frame lineup in North America. If you'd told me that 20 years ago, I would have said you were crazy. This is the smallest member of the family at 193.8 inches from tip to tail, and we do need to talk about this family because they're all very closely related. They're all riding on the new Toyota TNGA body-on-frame platform. Not just this, but also the full-size Land Cruiser internationally, the Sequoia, the 4Runner, the Tacoma, the Tundra, the Lexus GX, and the Lexus LX. They're all very closely related. And a lot of them share the same wheelbase. 112.2 inches from that wheel over there to this wheel over here is common with the 4Runner and the bigger Land Cruiser, and of course the Lexus GX. Which is right for you is going to depend on what kind of off-roading you plan on doing, whether you plan on doing it at all, how badly you want a third row, how big you want that third row to be, whether you like the boxy proportions we find here, or whether you'd like a Lexus dealer experience. But the important thing to know is that they all share a huge amount under the skin. The Land Cruiser shares the least when it comes to the interior with the rest of the family, and we'll get to that in a bit because that's the biggest thing to know about this versus the 4Runner, is that this interior feels more premium. Also though, I like the exterior style. It's a bit more practical back here because we have a taller roofline and a boxier back end, so even though it's not quite as long as the 4Runner in some dimensions, we have a more usable cargo area, I think, and certainly more headroom in the second row. Let's digress for a moment and talk about vehicle structural design. Basically, why is this different than a Jeep Grand Cherokee, a close competitor in the United States? Well, as I keep saying, this is a body-on-frame SUV, and that means that the body is separate from the frame. Quite logical. The body is where the cargo goes, where you're sitting, etc. The frame is everything that makes the vehicle move. So wheels, tires, suspension, engine, transmission, steering rack, all of that is part of the frame. And the two are not firmly connected. Now, obviously they're connected because otherwise the first time you went around a corner, the body would fall off and that would be kind of stupid. But importantly, they're not welded together and there is some motion isolation between the two, usually in the form of rubber isolators between the body and the frame. In a Grand Cherokee, everything is all one piece. It's a unibody vehicle just like a Corolla or a Civic or whatever, albeit much stronger of a unibody because of its off-road intentions. But at its core, that's the big deal. Body-on-frame SUVs like this tend to be a little bit more rugged because if you damage the frame, you can replace the frame, or if you damage the body, you can replace the entire body. You can even swap them around if for some reason you wanted to. And importantly, generally speaking, there's more isolation if you're towing. Towing capacity is not necessarily higher in a body-on-frame vehicle. It can be, but in fact, this towing capacity is below some unibody SUVs out there. Importantly though, when you're towing, that isolation between the frame and the body is important because the trailer, it's attached to the frame, whereas you're riding in the body, so it's going to be quieter inside. Now on the downside, we have less space efficiency. So even though this is relatively tall, if I popped open a door, you'll notice that the floorboards inside are higher off the ground than in something like a Grand Cherokee because we have that frame sitting there like a layer in a sandwich. Unibody designs tend to be better driving on-road as far as handling dynamics. They also tend to be more space efficient, but they don't have as much isolation as a body-on-frame design. That's it in a nutshell. The taillight modules are a bit different in North America than other markets because we get red turn signals in the back instead of the amber ones, but all markets get a separately opening hatch glass, which is a feature I really love. If you're carrying longer items like lumber or skis or whatever you might need to hang out the back, this is a really practical touch. Or if you simply want to be able to grab your groceries without having them roll out on the ground, that's also a nice thing. Of course, we can open the entire hatch if you want to, but the cargo load floor height is higher than normal, actually quite a bit higher than normal. That's partially because of the battery pack, but also just due to the design of the Land Cruiser. Everything is a little bit higher off the ground, from the floorboards to the cargo area, etc. Behind this little plastic cod piece is the 2-inch hitch receiver, but it's not as easy to remove and put back on as I would like. It actually has some pop rivets under there that you have to pull out. The pop rivets are definitely more of a pain to use than the twist toggles we find in many of the towing covers in the competition. And they're not as pronounced as this, again, kind of codpiece-like thing back here. It has a little tether on it to help keep it from flying off in traffic, but with it removed, you can see why it is so prominent, because the hitch receiver is actually quite a bit back from the bumper itself. That's due to the spare tire location, which is up under the back end. We have some pretty healthy attachment points there for your safety chains, 4-pin and 7-pin wiring harness over there on that side. I am surprised that, especially for the occasional tower, that Toyota didn't create some other cover to maybe just go around this upper part to make it look a bit more attractive, because for those weekend towers that really want to put this cover back on when their towing is complete, especially if you tow maybe only once a month, this is just kind of a pain to get on, remember all to get off, and then actually try and get back on when you're done. There's another unusual thing about this hitch receiver. If you look at it from below, you'll notice that we have the main channel of the receiver and then these additional pieces of metal on the side. That makes the combination much thicker than normal. So if you're using a normal hitch pin like that, it's not quite long enough. So in this, you will have to use one of these longer reach hitch pins right like that, so that way you can actually put the cotter pin on the other side. If you're a fan of solid axles, that's another reason to get the Land Cruiser, because we find one back here. Although, interestingly, that has nothing to do with the structure. You can do a solid axle in a unibody vehicle as well. That does impact the ground clearance, however, especially on the spec sheet, because not every car company measures ground clearance the same way. If you look at most ground clearance figures out there, they're talking about either the average or the highest point of clearance under the vehicle. With the Toyota lineup, they're talking about the rear differential case to the ground, which is the lowest point in the vehicle. It is possible to clear higher obstacles if you navigate around that rear differential. But importantly, because we have the solid axle in the back, the only way you can improve clearance above that differential or below that differential is to increase the diameter of the tire. Basically put bigger tires on the Land Cruiser, because that's the only thing that's going to get that axle up in the air. That's one of the benefits of an independent suspension, especially independent air suspensions, is that they can push those wheels down and really create kind of a triangle under the vehicle to improve that center line clearance. However, generally speaking, solid axles are going to be more durable and a little bit easier to repair if something goes wrong longer term. And that's why Toyota has kept this here. Also, we get slightly better towing dynamics depending on exactly what you're doing. Definitely another reason to do this. But again, everything is kind of variable here because there are plenty of unibody SUVs with independent suspensions that tow very, very well. With the slightly tidier dimensions and of course the Land Cruiser name, you might have assumed that this would have better approach, breakover, and departure angles than the 4Runner, but you would be wrong if we're talking about the TRD Pro or the new Trailhunter. At 32, 22, 23 degrees, this is better than most of the 4Runners, but those top-end models actually have notably better angles all the way around than this Land Cruiser. Under this hood, we find the same 326 horsepower turbocharged hybrid system that's in the Tacoma and the 4Runner, but instead of being optional, it's standard in the Land Cruiser. It's based around the same 2.4-liter turbo engine we find in a wide variety of different Toyota models. Under this hood, it likely produces 278 horsepower and 317 pound-feet of torque, but they're not specific on the engine's output solo. It's mated to a single electric motor and then an 8-speed automatic transmission behind that. And everything together gives you 326 horsepower, 465 pound-feet of torque. But importantly, it won't give you that forever, because that 1.8 kilowatt-hour battery pack in the back is eventually going to be consumed if you're towing uphill, and then you're going to be left with the approximately 278 horsepower of just the 2.4-liter turbo. And that's likely why towing capacity is lower than in the turbocharged V6 Lexus GX. This is rated for 6,000 pounds, which is a healthy reduction over that twin-turbo V6 in the Lexus. On the other hand, if you treat it gently, this system is rated for 23 mpg according to the EPA. We have not been able to achieve that this week, but it is still significantly more efficient than any Bronco or any Wrangler, which are also two very direct competitors. It's not just boxy on the outside, it's boxy on the inside as well. And that means if you like a more upright sitting position, you can definitely do it in the Land Cruiser. We have more headroom up front and in the back than we find in the 4Runner. Now, I would caution you, if you're looking at that chart on the side of your screen, it looks like this has more headroom than something like the Ineos Grenadier. If you want to know more about the Grenadier, we're going to take a deep dive in a separate video, this versus that. But remember that the Europeans don't always measure things the same way as the Americans do, and just sitting in the two back-to-back, it's obvious that the Grenadier actually does have more headroom. One thing it doesn't have, though, is a powered memory-linked tilt telescopic steering column. You find that in the top-end trim of the Land Cruiser. We also have a manual extending thigh cushion, but oddly enough, only two-way adjustable lumbar support. I would have loved to have seen four-way lumbar here. Jumping into the back, the first thing I noticed is that the rear doors don't open quite as wide as I might like, but we have a reasonable amount of room back here, especially given the general dimensions and mission of the Land Cruiser. The seat bottom cushion, it's a little bit lower to the ground for adults, so we have a little bit less thigh support, but that should be more comfortable for young children especially, or anybody with shorter legs. With the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, you can see I have a reasonable amount of legroom left, but if I scoot over to this side, where the front seat's all the way back in its tracks, you'll see I have basically no legroom left. In the middle, the extra headroom is really obvious versus the 4Runner, because in this position, I still have maybe about an inch and a half of headroom left here. We do have this pretty decent bulge for the power moonroof to go into, but still more headroom than we find in the 4Runner. One big reason to get this over that. The hump in the middle, it's still pretty pronounced because of course the four-wheel drive system, but we do have 3-zone automatic climate control with controls there and then vents up here in the ceiling. Now let's talk about child seats. We don't have any of those plastic doors over the latch anchors, but we have my next least favorite method for covering up latch anchors, which is this non-removable pleather section held on by Velcro. However, the latch anchors themselves are well positioned, very easy to latch into. Thanks to the tall roofline, there's a lot of room for adults to crawl inside and fiddle with those child seats, as you often have to. And for taller folks, the height is actually an advantage as well, because it's going to be easier ergonomically, easier on your back to get kids in and out. On the other hand, if you're a taller person, you should know you're probably not actually going to be able to fit a rear-facing child seat like this behind a taller driver up front. The driver's seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, and as you can see, there's just not enough legroom for a rear-facing infant seat, let alone some of those larger rear-facing convertible seats. Behind the power hatch, we find a big square opening and a big boxy cargo area capable of swallowing 46.2 cubic feet of stuff. Elsewhere in the world, you can get a third row in the Land Cruiser, but that's mutually exclusive with the hybrid system because the hybrid battery pack is right there under the floor. And that's why the floor has that extra bump up in terms of height. There is a small storage area right there, which is kind of handy. You could put your small knickknacks, first aid kit, etc. Remember that we do have a spare tire, but it's completely underneath the Land Cruiser. One thing that would have made this area more practical, though, is if they had redesigned the plastics in the back for the 2-row model. This is also something we see in the Lexus GX hybrid because you can't get the third row option in that one either. And actually, all of the plastics back here and the second row seat mechanisms are common with that Lexus GX. That means there's some wasted space in the armrest, the cup holders, those USB ports that you're not going to use unless you can plug in your cargo. But one thing that is handy is the air vents for the third row, because if you put pets in the back, they're really going to appreciate that. I don't know if they're going to use these grab handles, but you know, you might be able to train your puppy to do that. The second row seats, they also fold and tumble forward, which is an interesting touch for a 2-row SUV. You might not find that terribly useful, but actually if you wanted to pack bigger, bulkier items in here and keep them from flying forward into the front seats, that's actually a bit handier than the typical lie flat seats. A solid reason to get the Land Cruiser over the 4Runner is because you want a more premium interior. Up here we have controls for the power moonroof. Keep in mind that we are driving the top end trim. We have the digital rear view mirror there. We don't have slide to the side sun visors, but they do have the little slide out extension. We have vanity mirrors and lights for both the driver and the front passenger. The power moonroof, it's a pretty typically sized moonroof. And as I said before, it does affect headroom in this midsection right there by the door opening, but it has that bump out or bump up for the rear passengers, so that way second row headroom is basically the same as the model without the moonroof. Up front, we have height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable head restraints, but oddly enough, we don't have the exact same seat for the driver and the front passenger. We have moderate bolstering on both, but importantly, the seat does not move in the same way, and we don't have that manual thigh cushion extension for the front passenger. The seat is both heated and ventilated, however, just like the driver's seat. As we move on to the doors and the dashboard, the bigger differences between this and the 4Runner become obvious because we have softer materials and I think a more premium design than we find in the 4Runner. Remember that the 4Runner shares the majority of its interior actually with the Toyota Tacoma, which starts significantly lower than most 4Runner models. So we find more soft touch materials on the doors and on the dashboard. The dashboard's really obvious here because we have soft touch materials all across here. This sort of interesting stripe, kind of like what was going on in the Venza. Sort of a rubbery upper section of the dash. That stitched material there is kind of an imitation leather. And then we get a moderately sized slot style glove compartment. I was not able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside, but unlike some Toyota models with a tablet style thing mounted on the dashboard, we have a very different setup over here in the Land Cruiser. We have their more horizontal screen instead of that Boxier screen that we find in the other model. The 4Runner's 14-inch screen is definitely bigger than this, but I think this just integrates better in the dashboard. Apple CarPlay, of course, is not going to be quite as snazzy as that big screen, but the fundamental software is actually identical, the one to the other. So we have all the same Toyota software here with the native interface there, car options there, built-in navigation, etc. Unlike many cars on the market, a lot of vehicle settings are actually adjusted over here on the instrument cluster with the steering wheel controls rather than in the infotainment system itself. We have somewhat of an unusual arrangement for the power and volume knob. It's mounted on this little binnacle that pops out of that area between the two screens. The engine start-stop buttons right there, controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control system here. You can see again more premium wrapping all around that. Buttons for the heated and ventilated seats rather than digging around through the software is definitely a nice touch. But I kind of wish we didn't have the shiny black plastic around there because I do think those are going to get scratched. And indeed, we do see some fine scratches on that screen area there where we see the readout for the climate control system. Down here, we have the mode selector dial, and that's going to change its function based on these switches down here. So it becomes drive mode or MTS or the DAC crawl control, depending on what those buttons are set to. We have a button for the 360-degree camera system here, and it is Toyota's latest 360-degree camera, if I could spit that out, including the surround view, the various views, the augmented reality view, the transparent front end. So if we were driving along, the software would actually be calculating that black square and showing you what you had passed over. Down here we have USB ports, some charge-only ports, and an interface port. The system also supports wireless CarPlay. We have a wireless charging mat there, pretty typical console shifter, electric parking brake, auto brake hold, and then the controls for the four-wheel drive system here. We can lock the center coupling. This is a full-time Torsen-style center differential, but you can lock it, and you can lock the rear differential. There is no locking front, however. If you want that, you have to move up into the top-end Lexus LX, or just abandon Toyota entirely. We have a sway bar disconnect option here, and then a button to engage the low ratio mode over there. Two big cup holders, and then a padded center armrest that opens to reveal a storage area or a cool box if you have that particular option. This model has a full color head-up display over there, and as you can see again, the big LCD instrument cluster, but it's not mounted on the dashboard like a tablet computer like we find in some. Here are just some of those vehicle settings and safety system settings, etc., that you can toggle through in this system. There are a bunch of different layouts for that big LCD. Right here we have the driver monitoring cameras and a more attractive, I think, and chunkier steering wheel, just generally speaking, than we find in the 4Runner. The 4Runner, again, uses the steering wheel from the Tacoma. Actually, everything front doors and forward is shared with the Tacoma. This is very different. Over here we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system, which is standard, and the controls to work with that multifunction instrument cluster. To the left of the steering wheel, we find something that is sadly still a unicorn in many SUVs. It's an integrated trailer brake controller. That's something I wish every manufacturer would have. And then also an important thing to highlight over here, we have a button to turn on and off the onboard 2.4 kilowatt inverter. That's one big reason you might want to get the hybrid option over some of the non-hybrids in this segment if you plan on camping or overlanding, because you can power quite a lot with that onboard inverter at your campsite. It's time to get the Land Cruiser out on what I will loosely refer to as a paved road, because this is pretty rough, but I think it really demonstrates the usefulness of the Land Cruiser and really the kind of road surface that this suspension is designed for, a badly paved road like this. But before we get to that, let's talk about the drivetrain. This is a full hybrid, and right now I'm creeping along in electric-only operation, going 10 miles an hour. Oops, I was too aggressive with the throttle. We got to 12 miles an hour and it turned the engine on. It will turn it back off again if I pull my foot back off the throttle. You have to be really, really gentle to just drive in daily operation in EV mode. And that's probably why the fuel economy numbers aren't as impressive as you might think, especially in the city. This is certainly not going to be as aggressive at staying in electric operation due to its design and the fact that the motor's not as powerful as something like the Grand Highlander or a regular Highlander hybrid, something along those lines. But it does have an effect on 0 to 60 times, just not quite as much as you might hope. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 7.8 seconds. That's on the leisurely side for something with over 300 horsepower. It's actually slower than something like the Ineos Grenadier, which is not as powerful as this and not a hybrid either. It's also heavier than this, by the way. Obviously, that 0 to 60 testing was done on a road surface much smoother than this, as was our stopping testing or braking testing. It took 120 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's a pretty respectable distance for an off-road focused vehicle, especially one that weighs about 5,800 pounds depending on the options. For the handling score, I'm going to give this model a B. Comparisons are tricky because what do you compare this against? Is it a Wrangler competitor? Is it a Grand Cherokee competitor? Is it a Bronco competitor? Is it none of the above? Should this only be compared to 4Runner and Lexus GX, etc.? The Lexus lineup is going to be, generally speaking, a little bit softer than this, a little bit more comfortable, but we also have things like adaptive suspension systems available. And if you get the Lexus LX, you have an air suspension available as well. It's obviously going to be about double the cost of this model, but those are still features that are available in the Toyota lineup. This is actually pretty similar to the 4Runner in terms of its ride quality. You'll definitely notice that the rear axle's just bopping around back there, so you are feeling more of those bumps and imperfections come through into the cabin. It's not going to be as comfortable as some of the air suspension options, but I think that's mainly because the mission of the Land Cruiser is a bit more rational in this generation than it has been, depending on the generation we're talking about. They realized that most people are going to be driving this on their daily commute. It's going to go do the school run, it's going to do the grocery shopping. On weekends, maybe you're driving down roads like this to go to the national park, or perhaps you live out in the country, but you live on a gravel road like I do, or a badly paved asphalt road like this, and any way you slice it, this is a perfectly livable suspension. If you wanted to go really rugged off-roading, I would want something on the softer side. I would want something with a bit more ground clearance, a little bit more suspension travel. But as you can see, someone lives out here with a Camry and a Corvette, and they don't really seem to have much of a problem. So that's the kind of thing that this vehicle was tuned for. This is, again, sort of between worlds. If we think of a spectrum of SUVs where we have Wrangler and Bronco on one side, Grand Cherokee and Land Rover on the other side, then this is somewhere between those two realities. Remember that the Land Cruiser lives somewhat between worlds. It may have a solid rear axle in the back and an independent suspension up front like a Bronco, but it's not designed to quite be the same kind of off-road vehicle as a Bronco. Instead, this is somewhere between Bronco's mission and Grand Cherokee's mission. Maybe a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that's why we find suspension and driving dynamics that are also a little bit of this and a little bit of that. With that dual mission in mind, this reminds me a great deal of GM's GMT 360 SUVs from the mid-2000s, because they had a very similar philosophy of design and very similar driving dynamics, honestly, as a result. This is just a newer, fresher interpretation of that same general formula. And like those vehicles, when you get this in corners and you start driving a little bit harder, you'll notice that the non-independent rear suspension, the solid axle in the back, it can sort of skitter across the pavement a little bit in a way that a Grand Cherokee would not. At 50 miles an hour, I measured 72 decibels in this cabin, making it relatively quiet, but if you floor it, you definitely get more of that gruff 2.4-liter turbo in the cabin. This 2.4-liter engine is not the smoothest that I have heard, and that's something that I've complained about in Lexus models and Toyota models alike. I do wish they had given this engine a little bit more sound deadening. It's just a little bit gruffer than the average 2-liter or even some of those larger 2.5 and 2.7-liter turbos that you might find in some of the competition. Versus the Grand Cherokee 4xe with its 2-liter turbo, that's definitely quieter than the engine that we find in this model. On the other hand, the Land Cruiser has proved relatively efficient over our week of driving. Driving it relatively gently on the daily commute, we averaged 20.1 mpg. Over our total week of driving, I'm down at 18 mpg. Now, there's a good and a bad side to that. In something like the Grenadier, which is one of our long-term vehicles, we actually own that one, over the last few thousand miles, we have been averaging actually about the same kind of fuel economy that we get in this model, and it's a bit peppier, as I said. On the other hand, in the Land Cruiser, if you're more gentle with your acceleration and you're more gentle with your braking, and you keep those speeds to under maybe about 75 miles an hour, you could average over 20 mpg. So this has the possibility of getting closer to those EPA ratings, whereas the Grenadier, yeah, it's over-indexing the EPA rating of 15, which is pretty darn low, but you're never really going to get it much above 18. The above expectation fuel economy in the Grenadier is likely thanks to the BMW inline 6, which has been really efficient in every BMW that we've tested. The downside to that, of course, is going to be cost of maintenance and cost of fuel. Because it's designed to run on premium unleaded, this was tuned for regular unleaded. So not only is the fuel economy going to be a little bit better, you can feed it less expensive gasoline. Lot of pricing overlap between the 4Runner and the Land Cruiser, about $10,000 of overlap. There is also about $5,000 of pricing overlap between the Land Cruiser and the Lexus GX, but I do think they're a little bit better differentiated the one from the other. You could also take a look at something like a Wrangler or a Bronco in 4-door format, but fundamentally they are a little bit different. Wrangler and Bronco offer more capability with front lockers. They also have doors that come off and a roof that comes off, and those are designed to always stay on the Land Cruiser. Yeah, anybody can unbolt the door, but it's not meant to be user removable and then installable in 30 minutes or less, like we do find in the competition. For me, the most direct outside competitor to the Land Cruiser in the US right now would be something like a Grand Cherokee or perhaps something from the Land Rover portfolio. But let's talk about the Grand Cherokee first. The Grand Cherokee has a lot of price range, $38,490 starting all the way on up to about $88,000. So it gets significantly less expensive than the Land Cruiser, actually significantly less expensive than a 4Runner, and also significantly more expensive than even a Lexus GX, because there's a lot of option selection availability on that Grand Cherokee. And we're not even talking about the 3-row model, which can get more expensive as well. There is a hybrid Grand Cherokee, but it's a plug-in hybrid, so a little bit of a different thing going on than we find in the Land Cruiser, but the base engine is going to be the naturally aspirated V6 and traditional 8-speed automatic. Obviously, if you're looking for the most reliable, dependable option in this segment, it's probably going to be the Land Cruiser. But if you want extra capability, it's actually a good argument to be made for that Grand Cherokee if we're talking about stock factory capability, because the Grand Cherokee has an adaptive air suspension that gives it significantly more lift. I also think that the electronic traction control, stability control, and trail systems are just more refined and better done in the Grand Cherokee. Now, Toyota has improved their systems by absolute leaps and bounds in this Land Cruiser. It is significantly more refined than previous Toyota products when it comes to progress control, the all-terrain control, the hill descent control, etc. They all operate much more smoothly. But I think Jeep still has a bit of an edge there when it comes to that. I think Jeep also has an edge when it comes to comfort and software and interior design. I think that the interior is more premium in the Grand Cherokee. You can certainly get things like real wood trim, lots of leather dripping off of everything. You know, how reliable is it going to be? You know, I think you all know the answer there. Obviously, the reliability win is going to go to the Land Cruiser. Even though we don't have much data on it, I think it's a pretty safe bet that that's where we should put our reliability bets. On the other hand, if you want something a bit more comfortable, I think the Grand Cherokee rides better than the Land Cruiser. It also handles better than the Land Cruiser because of its unibody design, and of course has that air suspension. And then you're going to want to go in the direction of the Jeep. Also, if you want to save some cash, there is the Grand Cherokee in the lower end trims. The base model starts $20,000 less than the Land Cruiser. By the time you add a few options on there, you're still looking at $10,000 less with a lot more cash on the hood of that Jeep. And are you going to spend $10,000 extra in repairs and maintenance over the average ownership cycle? Probably not. So the Grand Cherokee could still end up less expensive. You're just gonna have to deal with the realities of that. And I do think that the base Grand Cherokee models, the interior comes across as a little cheesy, a little too rubbery on the dashboard. You have to work your way up to the sort of the mid-level trims before you get that more premium feel that I was talking about. But the real competition is not from Jeep, I would argue. The real competition is actually from Toyota themselves, because we have the 4Runner and we have the Lexus GX that are really very, very similar. In fact, similar enough that they share almost a common frame. GX, of course, and Land Cruiser basically do share a common frame. 4Runner, it's slightly modified, but they run on the same platform, and they have the same wheelbase, and they have basically the same axle. They have the same transmissions available, etc. The bigger differences here are what hybrid drivetrains or non-hybrid drivetrains are available in each one, and that's where you really see that progression of pricing. So 4Runner's the least expensive, we have Land Cruiser in the middle, then we have Lexus GX above. 4Runner starts with the non-hybrid 4-cylinder turbo drivetrain. Land Cruiser makes the hybrid system standard. GX makes the twin-turbo V6 engine standard that we find in other vehicles in the Toyota lineup, like the Sequoia, of course, and the Toyota Tundra as well. Also, the Lexus LX. Now, the Lexus GX will also have a hybrid system coming in the future at some point, but they have been a little bit cagey on exactly when that is going to come. Focusing on the 4Runner first, the hybrid system being optional is an interesting twist there. Hybrid system in the 4Runner, it could be a little bit less expensive than the Land Cruiser depending on exactly how you option it up, but I would argue that by the time you've added that hybrid system to the 4Runner, you might as well just jump up into the Land Cruiser, because I think the Land Cruiser is a more comfortable vehicle. It has a taller roofline. One common complaint about the 4Runner has long been its seating position and the relatively little headroom that we find inside. It has significantly improved in this 4Runner, but it's still better in the Land Cruiser, and the cargo area is definitely more practical. Of course, if you want the rear window that slides down into the hatch, you want the 4Runner. If you want the window that's hinged and flips up, you want the Land Cruiser. If you want the more cargo capacity, you want the Land Cruiser as well. The 4Runner is available with the teeny tiny third row. It's probably an option I would select if I was also interested in those trims where it is available. And keep in mind, you can't get it with the hybrid. It's not available in every trim. As far as on-road handling goes, they're very, very similar. The 4Runner could be a little bit better because it has a slightly lower center of gravity, but we're not talking about a big difference here. Really, it's going to come down to price, styling, and whether you want that more premium, nicer feeling interior in the Land Cruiser. It's not just a style thing here. The materials are more premium in the Land Cruiser. The upper section of the dashboard, it's not shared with the Tacoma. And that's probably the important thing to know about the 4Runner before we move on, is that the front door's forward, it's shared with the Tacoma that has a much lower base price. So those hard plastics, etc., I think they're fine in the Tacoma, not quite as fine in the 4Runner. Now, if you want the more premium interior, obviously you want the Lexus GX. But weirdly, in the Lexus lineup, this does not have as Lexus of an interior as I thought it should. It's lacking the real leather and the real wood trim that you would expect inside a lot of Lexuses. It comes across as a little bit monochrome, a little bit colder, maybe not quite as luxurious as I had expected. Maybe that's to separate it more from the Lexus LX, which still has lots of leather everywhere and lots of wood trim, etc. But that Lexus LX starts at $106,000, so is quite expensive. Now, not only does the GX get more power with that twin-turbo V6, it also has a 10-speed automatic transmission, and thanks to the new Overtrail trim, you have a few more options available as far as off-road capability, most notably the EKDSS system that we have in the Lexus GX. It's like the old hydraulic KDSS system, only they've added some electronic actuators to make it function a little bit more smoothly, more predictably, and supposedly have better articulation than the older system as well. Instead of having disconnectable sway bars, what they do is they have cross-linked hydraulics that allows the front and rear wheels to lift up and down to give you a better contact patch for the ground than you'd be able to get in a traditional suspension without the complexity of a mechanical sway bar disconnect, and also improving handling out on the road just a little bit. The other reasons to get the Lexus, obviously, though, are the Lexus dealer experience, the larger LCD, more tech available inside the Lexus, and that big Lexus logo as well. The last thing you should keep in mind is towing capacity. It's going to be the highest in the GX out of this trio. Even though the 4Runner and the Land Cruiser and the GX share an awful lot structurally, they don't have the power, the consistent power, to tow 9,000 pounds, just over. And we do get that in the GX. It all seems to come down to that transmission, the power, and the way that helps improve the performance in the J2807 testing. And it is J2807 rated, just in case you're wondering. Now, bottom line, which of these three would I get? Honestly, I'd get the Land Cruiser. I think it's the Goldilocks just right option here. The hybrid system is going to give it just a little bit of an advantage over the GX in real world driving. I think it's peppy enough in most driving situations as well. It's big, it's practical, it's boxy, and it's going to be pretty reliable, all things considered. I know a lot of people are worried about that 2.4 liter turbo. Is it going to be as reliable as the outgoing V8s or V6 engines that Toyota has used in the past? But for the average owner that's going to drive maybe 100,000 miles, maybe 150,000 miles, I would have absolutely no worries at all. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you pick if you're shopping in this segment, or if you already bought a Land Cruiser, let us know why you bought it over that new 4Runner or over a Lexus GX. See all of you later.